Welcome to the Perspicacious Perspective. After chatting with a lot of people about politics in the past, I've realised that there's a lot of confusion about what political labels people should use to describe their political beliefs. As much as you might think I would judge people based on their political beliefs, I actually don't care, considering I genuinely believe that most of us want the same things, especially if you're born in the West and would identify to fall outside of the top 10% of the wealthiest people in the nation. I just think a lot of people find it hard to articulate what beliefs and labels they should use, since there's a lot of political terminology that people may find confusing. A prime example I've come across is people who identify as communists in the West. Whenever I find someone who identifies as a communist, I always start by asking them about which communist systems around the world they like. This is normally the point that I ascertain that they don't really know what communism is or what it entails, and I don't blame them. It was only after living in China for 5 years that I became familiar with what a communist ideology is, how it's different to socialism, and what these ideologies look like in practice. My goal in this episode is to give you a better understanding of what these political economic systems are, which countries in the world today have these systems, and how you can use these political labels to better describe your political beliefs. Before we go through the political labels, let's first remind ourselves of the socio-economic positions we refer to, which are typically tied to wealth, income, and production in a capitalist system like the USA, for example. These terms do differ when looking through a Marxist lens, but I'll clarify what those equivalents are when we come to talking about the far left. So the socio-economic positions that exist in a capitalist system, starting from the wealthiest class, include the upper class. These are extremely wealthy individuals and families with inherited or accumulated fortunes. They control economic and political institutions and tend to be the top 1% of the population, which usually includes billionaires and large shareholders. The upper middle class. These are the highly educated professionals with significant income and status, often in medicine, law, academia, or business. For example, doctors, lawyers, or corporate executives. The middle class. This is the white-collar class with stable incomes, some property, and education, but not extreme wealth. For example, small business owners and mid-level managers. The lower middle class, or the working middle class, is what's considered to be the next class. These are office workers, sales staff, and service sector employees who may live paycheck to paycheck but maintain middle class aspirations. This includes office clerks, retail supervisors, and skilled tradespeople. The working class. These are what are considered the manual and service labourers who tend to have lower incomes and less job security. This includes factory workers, truck drivers, and warehouse staff. Then we have the working poor. These are people who have jobs but earn too little to escape poverty. For example, fast food workers, cleaners, and seasonal farm workers. And the bottom class is what they call the underclass. These are the long-term unemployed. It includes marginalized groups in society or those excluded from the labour market entirely. For example, homeless people and people relying on welfare without any real job prospects. We also need to be clear on what the major types of political economic systems that countries can adopt. We have systems that define economic foundations such as capitalism, socialism, and communism, and we have systems that define political structures such as a monarchy, a republic, a theocracy, or authoritarianism. Let's go through them one by one, and I'll give you an example of a country in the world that has this system today or has infamously adopted this system in the past. So capitalism is an economic and political system where the means of production are privately owned and markets determine production and distribution of wealth. The government generally protects property rights but limits interference in the economy. The United States is an example of what people would deem a predominantly capitalist system, even though its government possesses elements of regulation of the market and welfare, which makes it less capitalistic. Socialism is where the government plays a large role in redistributing wealth and providing public services, even though markets and private ownership may still exist, like a capitalist system. Sweden might be described as democratic socialism or a social democracy. It operates economically as a capitalist system, as markets and private ownership exists, but government intervention helps the country have a strong welfare state and unions to protect the lower working classes. Communism is when the state owns or controls the means of production entirely, and class distinctions are completely abolished. So that means no upper class, no middle class, and no working class. Everyone works and operates for the government, the state, or what China might call the people. When I was living in China, I was confused as I thought, why are there so many wealthy business owners and why are there so many working class people, considering this is supposed to be a communist system? Well, it's because China aims to have a completely communist system someday. The Chinese Communist Party actually acknowledges that China is still in the primary stages of socialism. That means the party justifies allowing markets, private business, and foreign investment as temporary tools to strengthen socialism before moving towards full communism. Cuba is another country that has a technically socialist system with communist aspirations. Fascism is a far-right authoritarian system which combines nationalism, suppression of opposition, and collaboration between the state and industry. It's extremely rare today, but historically, you might think of Mussolini's Italy, who of course was part of the Axis powers during World War II, alongside Hitler's fascist Germany and Emperor Hirohito's fascist Japan. Even though North Korea identifies as having a socialist system, like China, a lot of people would argue it's the most fascist nation in the world today due to how violently dissent is suppressed in the country and how Kim Jong-un has built a cult of personality around himself. But just to be clear, there are no openly fascist nations in the world, which is a success, since that's what the Allied powers fought against during World War II. A theocracy is a government ruled by or strongly influenced by religious leaders and laws. Iran is governed under Islamic law with clerical oversight of elected officials. This makes it a theocracy. An absolute monarchy is a hereditary ruler, king, queen, or emir, that holds ultimate authority, unchecked by constitutions or legislatures. Saudi Arabia is ruled by the House of Saud with absolute control, opposed to, let's say, the monarchy in the UK, who has little control over the government or legislatures, thanks to Oliver Cromwell. The UK is considered a constitutional monarchy, as a monarchy exists, but real governing power lies with the constitutionally established parliament and elected government. A republic is a state without a monarch, usually governed by elected officials representing the people, often with a constitution. France is an example of a country considered a semi-presidential republic with both a president and prime minister. An oligarchy is a nation that's ruled by a small elite class, which could be an elite wealthy class, an elite military class, or something similar. This somewhat overlaps with plutocracy, which is a system where wealth determines power, either formally or informally. An example would be today's Russia, often described as an oligarchy due to the dominance of wealthy elites and oligarchs close to political power. Some argue that the United States trends towards plutocracy due to the influence of billionaires and lobbying. An aristocracy is a country ruled by a hereditary nobility or elite class. Pre-revolutionary France would be a good example, and the UK today retains aristocratic influence via the House of Lords. These are members of Parliament, the governing body in the UK, who are not elected. They inherit their membership through bloodline. The UK isn't considered an aristocracy, as aristocrats don't have full control of the government. A technocracy is ruled by technical experts such as scientists, engineers, and bureaucrats, which emphasizes expertise over popular will. Today's Singapore would be the closest example. While Singapore is democratic, it's often described as technocratic due to the dominance of trained experts in policymaking. A meritocracy is the rule or allocation of positions based on merit, education, or ability rather than wealth or birth. China describes its Communist Party promotion system as meritocratic, but critics would argue it's also authoritarian, as, for example, to join the Chinese Communist Party, you're required to renounce any religious beliefs. Authoritarianism is a system with concentrated power in a leader or small group. In this system, there's limited political freedoms and completely restricted opposition. For example, Belarus has ruled under Alexander Lukashenko since 1994 with little genuine opposition. Totalitarianism is an extreme form of authoritarianism, where the government seeks to control all aspects of life, politics, economy, culture, and even thought. North Korea's pervasive surveillance, censorship, and a cult of personality around the Kim dynasty make it a good example of a totalitarian state. Anarchism is a system rejecting state authority altogether. It favours decentralised self-governance, voluntary cooperation, and direct democracy. Anarchist Catalonia during the Spanish Civil War would be a historical example, and the autonomous regions in northern Syria with anarchist-inspired governance would be the closest modern-day example. If that isn't a clear example, think of any zombie apocalypse film or TV series you've ever watched before. Federalism is a political system where sovereignty is constitutionally divided between a central authority and regional states or provinces. The US, Germany, and India are examples of nations with federal structures which are meant to balance national and local power. A confederation is a looser union of sovereign states that delegate limited powers to a central authority. The European Union is an example of a confederation of sovereign states, European Union members, who have delegated limited powers to the European Union. Populism is a system on the left or right wing which emphasizes direct appeal to the people against elites. Hitler would be an example of a populist. He believed he represented the German people's will. It's someone who believes they represent the frustrations of the common people against the elite ruling minority. The trend historically has been that once a populist obtains the power they fought for, they incrementally become more authoritarian, using the military to crush any dissenting opinions. Militarism is when the government is directly controlled by the military, which often follows a coup. For example, Myanmar, also known as Burma, has been ruled by a military junta since the 2021 coup. So if you haven't noticed yet, a lot of these systems overlap. The UK, for example, is best described as having a capitalist economic system. However, it also has elements of a social democracy. It has welfare, a national health service, social housing, employment benefits, pensions, and public education is provided by the government. It also has a constitutional monarchy and an aristocracy that does influence the political system. For example, all pieces of legislation need to be passed through the House of Lords, who are not elected representatives of the people, and all new laws need to be ratified by the monarch. Let's move on to the political compass. Now, it's pretty inconvenient to tell you exactly where one of the following political labels fall on the political compass, so I'm just going to group each political label together so you have an idea of where it would be on the left or right side of the political compass. Perhaps because most of us have been born during relatively peaceful times in the West, we've forgotten that there is a centre on the political spectrum. So if someone doesn't agree with the political theory you have, it doesn't necessarily mean they're far left or far right. Maybe they're more centrist. If someone were truly far right or far left, it would probably mean that they want a complete upheaval in government, as there are very few governments in the world that are completely far left or far right. So use this terminology wisely. So let's start with the far left. Communists believe in the eventual abolition of private property and the establishment of a classless, stateless society. They hold that capitalism inherently exploits workers and must be replaced by collective ownership of production, and that economies ought to be planned centrally by the government. Communism is deemed as far left and authoritarian. Marxists adopt Karl Marx's theory in that history is driven by class struggle, and that capitalism will eventually be replaced by socialism and then communism. The difference between communism and Marxism is that Marxism is the theory, proposed by Karl Marx of course, and communism is the political project and goal derived from Marxist theory. Therefore, all communists are Marxists, but not all Marxists are communists. For example, Some Marxists just study capitalism without endorsing a revolution. So Marxism is like the blueprint, and communism is like the house that's supposed to be built from that blueprint. Marxism is also deemed as far left and often authoritarian. Leninism is another branch of Marxism that follows the doctrines of Vladimir Lenin, who argued that a disciplined vanguard party must seize state power to lead the working class. They also justify a transitional socialist state before moving to communism. So Marxism provided the theory, and Leninism provided the strategy for how to move towards a communist state. All Leninists are Marxists, but not all Marxists are Leninists. All Leninists are communists, since they believe in the eventual communist state, but not all communists are Leninists, since they may not agree with Vladimir Lenin's theory for how to eventually transition from a capitalist or socialist state to a communist state. Leninism would be considered far left and strongly authoritarian. Trotskyism is another strategy within Marxism for how to reach an eventual communist society. The difference between Trotskyism and Leninism is that Lenin wanted to build socialism in one country first, while Trotsky insisted on international revolution as the only way to succeed. So again, all Trotskyists are Marxists, but not all Marxists are Trotskyists. All Trotskyists are communists because they believe in the eventual communist state, but not all communists are Trotskyists because they may not agree with Trotsky's vision for how to build a communist state. Trotskyists are far left and are moderately authoritarian. Maoism is another strategy within Marxism. Like Leninism and Trotskyism, it's a strategy for how to get from capitalism to communism, but Chairman Mao adapted Marxism-Leninism to China's unique conditions in the 20th century. Marx and Lenin thought the revolution would come from the industrial working class, the proletariat, but China was overwhelmingly rural and peasant-based. Lenin believed the vanguard party of the urban working class would lead the revolution, and even though Mao believed the vanguard party still mattered, he believed the revolution would begin in the countryside, led by peasants, with guerrilla warfare as the strategy. Trotskyists believed that socialism cannot survive in one country alone. However, Maoists believed that socialism can be built in one country, as long as peasants carried out a continuous struggle and the party remained vigilant against new elites, or new middle-class enemies they call the bourgeoisie. Maoists reject Trotskyism's internationalism in practice, and Maoism is considered far left and authoritarian. Syndicalists are also far left communists. Syndicalism is influenced by Marxism, but is not strictly a branch of it. They also want to abolish capitalism and create a classless, stateless society, but they reject Leninist, Trotskyists, and Maoist methods of seizing and holding state power. They don't believe in seizing state power. They think that produces hierarchy and authoritarianism. Instead, they want workers to build dual power structures inside unions and then replace capitalism directly with self-managed industry. On the economic axis, syndicalists are far left. They want collective ownership, abolition of capitalism, and a communist society. On the authority axis, they are libertarian. They reject state authority, centralized party rule, or any hierarchical structures. In America, libertarian usually refers to right-wing libertarianism, which advocates for a minimal state, free markets, and private property. In European left tradition, libertarianism means anti-authoritarian socialism. That's abolition of the state, self-management, and direct democracy from the people. However, in the leftist context, far-left libertarians are communists who reject the state and centralized authority. So they want economic equality, which makes them far left, and they want maximal personal and social freedom, which makes them libertarian. Anarchists are far left because they share the same end goal as Marxists. They want a classless, stateless society, but they're not the same as Marxists because they reject any transitional state or vanguard parties. They want to abolish capitalism, abolish private ownership of the means of production, and abolish a class society. Anarchism is a family of theories that reject any transitional state. They argue that seizing state power only recreates hierarchy. They're closer to syndicalists in rejecting the state, but even more radical in rejecting all centralized authority. They oppose Leninism, Trotskyism, and Maoism because those rely on party authority in transitional states, which anarchists see as inevitably authoritarian. They're libertarian because they want radical individual freedom, radical self-governance, and direct democracy from the people, combined with collective ownership of resources. Unlike right-wing libertarians who want free markets, anarchist libertarians believe real freedom is impossible under capitalism because economic inequality creates domination. Socialism is an economic system where the means of production are owned or controlled collectively by the state, workers, or cooperatives. They often include welfare states and can be at a stage on the way to communism. So not all socialists are communists, since they may not believe in the eventual communist state, which also differs them from Marxist theory. Socialism by itself doesn't require vanguard or dictatorship. Democratic socialists, for example, want socialism through elections. Since anarchists want to abolish the state completely, that differs them from socialism, since socialism can still include a state through democratic socialism or even one-party socialism, like Cuba or China, for example. At its heart, socialism means collective or common ownership of the means of production rather than private capitalist ownership. All anarchists agree that capitalism must be abolished because it creates exploitation, hierarchy, and inequality. All traditional anarchists are socialists because they seek to abolish capitalism and establish collective ownership. Their uniqueness lies in rejecting state authority, believing socialism can only exist if it is also libertarian, decentralized, directly democratic, and non-hierarchical. Socialism is the broad umbrella of systems seeking collective ownership and equality. Communism is the most radical form of socialism since it's stateless, classless, and moneyless. Marxism, Leninism, Trotskyism, Maoism, syndicalism, and anarchism are all different strategies or theories for how to get there. If socialism is organized through a centralized state, it can become authoritarian. If socialism is organized without a state, for example through federations of workers' councils, communes, or cooperatives, it's libertarian. Eco-socialists merge environmentalism with socialism. They argue that capitalism causes environmental destruction because it prioritizes profit over sustainability. They want a socialist system where resources and production are collectively managed to protect both people and the planet. Libertarian eco-socialists argue you can't save the environment through top-down authoritarian structures, only through decentralized, democratic, and community-based socialism. But statist eco-socialism also exists, so not every eco-socialist is libertarian. Leftist is the umbrella term for anyone on the political left. So all of the political labels I just mentioned are leftists. So let's move on to the centre-left. Now you have a better idea of Marxism, communism, and socialism, and how they can be libertarian, little to no state control, or authoritarian, advocating state or party control. It should be easier to work out the other political theories I'm about to go through. So when someone claims to be progressive, they believe in reform through gradual improvement, addressing inequality, injustice, and social problems within the framework of democracy and regulated capitalism. Progressives want to expand rights, welfare, and fairness without overthrowing the system entirely. For example, expanding universal healthcare, raising the minimum wage, regulating corporations to reduce inequality, protecting civil rights, and enacting environmental protections. They're centre-left because they reject the radical restructuring that socialists and communists demand. Instead, they aim to balance capitalism with social justice. Progressives are not libertarian in the economic sense, since they want regulation, not free markets, but they're libertarian leaning in the social and cultural sense. They champion civil liberties such as freedom of speech, press, and assembly. They strongly defend individual rights such as women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, and racial equality, and they resist authoritarianism, censorship, and state intrusion into personal life. This makes progressives socially libertarian and anti-authoritarian in personal freedoms. Social democrats believe in reforming capitalism by combining free markets with strong welfare states, worker protections, and democratic institutions. Unlike socialists, social democrats do not seek to abolish capitalism. Instead, they aim to tame capitalism so it serves social justice and equality. Like progressives, Social democrats are libertarian on social and political issues. They defend civil liberties, pluralism, and democracy. They reject authoritarianism, unlike Leninists or Maoists, and they support individual rights alongside collective welfare. Economically, however, they are not libertarian at all. They favour strong state intervention in markets, which makes them mildly authoritarian. A liberal believes in individual rights, civil liberties, democracy, and equality under law. Not all liberals are leftist. Liberals accept capitalism as the default system, while most leftists want to reform or replace it. Liberals are centre-left only when they adopt social liberalism, prioritising welfare, civil rights, and regulation of markets. They're libertarian leaning since they advocate for strong defence of civil liberties and democratic freedoms. Left-wing populists typically focus on the conflict between the people and the elite, emphasising that the economic and political systems favour a small, wealthy, and powerful elite at the expense of ordinary people. They believe in economic inequality since they focus on wealth redistribution, labour rights, and social welfare. They believe in anti-elitism since they criticise corporations, financial institutions, and sometimes political establishments. They call for empowering ordinary people politically and economically, and they often promote pluralism and multiculturalism, though this can vary. Essentially, they are the ordinary people are being exploited by a corrupt elite, and the system needs to be radically changed in the people's favour. Now let's move on to the centre of this political compass. Centrists prioritise practical solutions over ideology, often blending left and right-wing ideas. They avoid extremes, seeking policies that appeal to a broad range of people. They're willing to adapt positions based on evidence or shifting circumstances rather than strict ideology. They believe that the best policy is the one that works, not the one that fits an ideological label. Moderates are almost identical to centrists. Centrists are a type of moderate, but moderates can lean pragmatically left or right without necessarily aiming for ideological balance. Third way is a political ideology that seeks to blend aspects of capitalism and socialism, which accepts private enterprise and globalization, supports welfare programs, education and healthcare, and focuses on results rather than strict left or right-wing doctrines. It's about using markets to achieve social goals rather than rejecting capitalism outright or leaving it completely unchecked. The name comes from positioning itself between the traditional left and the traditional right. Essentially, it's a middle path that accepts markets but uses the state to promote social equality. A technocrat, as briefly explained earlier, is someone who governs or makes policy primarily based on expertise, data, and technical knowledge rather than ideology, party loyalty, or popular opinion. They advocate for evidence-based decision-making. They believe that policies should be scientifically, economically, or technically sound. Essentially, they believe the smartest, most qualified people should run the system, not politicians or populists. Technocrats can be mildly authoritarian because they prioritize implementation and efficiency over popular consent, and if necessary, they're willing to bypass political debate if it slows down evidence-based solutions. A civil libertarian prioritizes individual freedoms and rights, especially in relation to government power. Their core principles consist of maximizing personal freedoms, including speech, assembly, privacy, and conscience, minimizing state interference in personal and economic life, and protecting minority rights against majority overreach. Essentially, they believe the government should interfere as little as possible in people's lives while protecting individuals' rights. A globalist prioritizes international cooperation, integration, and interconnectedness across politics, economics, and society. They believe in free trade and open markets across borders, strong international institutions, global problem solving, and an emphasis on humanity as a whole rather than strictly national interest. Essentially, they believe problems and opportunities are global, so solutions must transcend national boundaries. Globalists can be moderately authoritarian because global coordination may require compliance with international agreements, regulations, or institutions. They're defined by scope rather than ideology. A globalist can be left, right, or centrist economically and socially. An isolationist prioritizes national sovereignty, self-reliance, and minimal foreign entanglement. They want to avoid wars, foreign aid, and alliances unless absolutely necessary. They believe in economic protectionism using tariffs, trade barriers, and domestic industry protection. They believe in strict immigration control to protect cultural identity and domestic labour, and are skeptical of international institutions. Essentially, they believe that nations should focus on themselves, not on the world's problems. Isolationists tend to be moderately to highly authoritarian, especially on borders, trade, and cultural policies. They may support strong state control to enforce national independence and identity. Isolationism is about scope and sovereignty, the opposite of globalism. It appeals to those who feel globalization erodes national culture, security, and economic independence. While isolationists often promote domestic liberty, they are frequently authoritarian on social, immigration, and trade policies. Now let's shift over to the centre-right. It should be becoming a bit more obvious as to why the political labels are where they are on the political compass, and you should be able to work out by now why the political theory is more libertarian or more authoritarian, or both. Classical liberals believe in individual liberty. That's freedom of thought, speech, religion, and property. They believe in a limited government, that the state only exists to protect life, liberty, and property, nothing more. They believe in free markets, so that means economic freedom, private enterprise, and minimal regulation to drive prosperity. They believe in the rule of law, the equal application of laws, impartial justice, and constitutional constraints on power. They believe that individuals possess rights inherently, that it's not granted by governments. They advocate for tolerance and pluralism by respecting differing views and lifestyles as long as they don't infringe on others. Essentially, they believe in maximizing individual freedom while minimizing government power. Classic liberals are strongly pro-market and skeptical of state intervention, which aligns them with the modern right. They oppose large welfare states and heavy regulation, which puts them at odds with social democrats and left liberals. Historically, they were progressive. They advocated for the abolition of slavery and expansion of voting rights, but in modern politics, their economic focus makes them look more right-leaning. On the authoritarian-libertarian spectrum, they sit firmly on the libertarian side, though not as extreme as anarchists. Neoliberals believe in free market with active state management. They think markets are the best way to allocate resources, but government should create the right frameworks for markets to thrive. In terms of globalization, they promote free trade, open borders for capital, and international competition. They believe restrictions on businesses should be reduced and state-owned enterprises should be sold off. They advocate for welfare reform. Social safety nets are fine, but they should be made more targeted and efficient. Essentially, they believe markets should be put first, but guided by smart government intervention to keep them efficient. This makes them more globalist and pragmatic, but less libertarian. Conservatism is less a single doctrine and more a disposition or worldview. Conservatives believe in tradition and continuity. They believe that established customs, institutions, and cultural values should be preserved. They're skeptical of radical change. They believe social and political change should be gradual and cautious. They think a stable society requires respect for authority, law, and institutions. They think that natural social hierarchies are inevitable and often beneficial, that individuals have duties to family, community, and nation. They advocate for strong support for property rights as a stabilizing social force, and they believe policies should be tested against real-world outcomes, not abstract ideals. Essentially, they want to preserve what works, change should be carried out cautiously, and they value order and tradition. In economics, conservatives are generally pro-market, skeptical of redistribution and large welfare states. In terms of society, they often favour traditional hierarchies and cultural norms, which puts them on the right compared to egalitarian ideologies. And in politics, authority, stability, and order aligns with right-wing positions. Conservatives can range from moderately libertarian to strongly authoritarian. In practice, Many modern conservative parties combine economic liberalism with social conservatism. Conservatives believe in preserving tradition, order and authority while supporting markets and property rights. They are right-wing because they favour hierarchy over equality, and they lean authoritarian when defending cultural or political order. The right wing isn't one single ideology. It's a broad category of political thought that supports hierarchy and order in society, economy or culture, skepticism of radical egalitarianism, and value of tradition, authority or markets over collective redistribution. Historically, the term originates from the French Revolution. Those who sat on the right of the assembly supported monarchy, hierarchy and tradition, and those on the left supported radical change and equality. Those on the right tend to support individual responsibility over collective welfare, support for private property and free enterprise, defense of tradition, religion or national identity, law, order and authority as stabilizing forces, skepticism of utopian social engineering, and acceptance of social economic inequality as natural or necessary. Essentially, the right wing believes that society functions best when traditions, hierarchies and markets are respected, not when they're dismantled for equality. The right isn't always authoritarian. It can span both ends of the spectrum. It can contain both libertarian strands, for example, economic freedom, and authoritarian strands, for example, protecting cultural or national order. Neoconservatives believe in strong interventionist foreign policy to defend democracy and interests abroad. They believe in spreading democracy, often through military intervention if necessary. They support high military spending, global presence, and forming alliances when useful. They're skeptical of international institutions, and they believe in unapologetically defending their values. Since neoconservatism emerged in the US, neoconservatives in America essentially believe the US must lead the world with strength, projecting democracy and power because it is uniquely good and necessary for global order. They tend to be more authoritarian than libertarian due to emphasis on national security and interventionism. Neoconservatism is a right-wing ideology defined by interventionist foreign policy, strong defense of democracy through military power, pro-market economics and national strength, making it more authoritarian than libertarian. Paleoconservatism, similarly to neoconservatism, emerged in the late 20th century in the US. Paleoconservatives believe America should defend its borders, traditions and workers, but not meddle abroad. Neoconservatives, however, believe that America must lead the world, spread democracy, and use its power globally to protect itself and others. Paleoconservatism is inward-looking, protectionist, traditionalist, and non-interventionist, while neoconservatism is outward-looking, free market-friendly, and interventionist, using US power to shape the world. Paleoconservatism is a right-wing ideology that advocates for tradition, nationalism, cultural preservation, protectionism, and non-intervention abroad. It's socially authoritarian, but anti-globalist and anti-interventionist. If you haven't identified any political theories that best describe what you believe in so far, then that worries me since we're now heading into Hitler territory. The following political theories and labels are all considered the far right. That includes minarchism, which is the most libertarian of the far-right political theories I'm about to go through. The rest are considered relatively authoritarian, and you'll see why. Minarchism means minimal state libertarianism. Its central belief is that government should exist, but only in the most limited form possible. They believe the state's only legitimate functions are to protect citizens from force and fraud through police, courts, and the military, and to enforce contracts and property rights. They advocate for freedom of speech, association, religion, and believe that lifestyle choices are paramount. They believe the state should not intervene in the economy beyond basic legal protections, and that most services, including healthcare, education, and welfare, should be handled privately, voluntarily, or through communities or charities. In short, they believe that the state should exist, but only as a referee, not as a player. Minarchists want as much freedom as possible in both economics and personal life, which makes them highly libertarian. A reactionary doesn't just want to conserve the present, like a conservative. They want to restore a past order they see as superior. Reactionary comes from the idea of reacting against modernity or progress. Reactionaries believe modern progress has ruined society. They want to restore a past hierarchical order with strong authority, making them far right and strongly authoritarian. They believe in the reversal of social progress, a return to tradition, and acceptance of strong social, class, racial, or gender hierarchies. They believe in strong authority and show preference for monarchy, dictatorship, or theocracy over democracy. They're nationalistic and believe strong religious or cultural codes should govern society. In short, reactionaries believe progress has ruined society and the past was better, so we must go back, even if by force. The right already emphasizes hierarchy, tradition, and skepticism of equality. Reactionaries take this to the extreme. They believe in the total rejection of egalitarianism, whether economic, racial, or gender-based. They show support for absolute hierarchy, kings over subjects, men over women, elites over masses. They manifest hostility towards democracy itself. They see it as destabilizing and too equal. Because they want to reverse modern reforms, not just slow them down, they're placed on the far right end of the political compass. Nationalists believe the nation, meaning its sovereignty, identity, and unity, must be defended above all else, making them typically right-wing and often authoritarian when exclusion or conformity is enforced. They believe the nation should be free from outside control. They believe a shared identity, culture, or ethnicity should bind people together. They believe the nation's interests come before international or cosmopolitan ones. They're suspicious of outsiders. That means they view immigration, multiculturalism, and supranational organizations like the European Union or the United Nations as a threat. And they don't just take pride in their country, they believe it must be protected, strengthened, and restored. Right-wing populists also divide the pure, hard-working people and the corrupt elite. Right-wing populists believe we, the true nationals, must defend our culture, borders, and jobs from outsiders and elites, whereas left-wing populists believe we, the working people, must reclaim economic and political power from corrupt elites and corporations. Right-wing populists believe that the nation or ethnic majority is central, and foreigners, immigrants, and minorities are often framed as threats. They're anti-globalist and believe in strong enforcement of borders, policing, and traditional morality. They're culturally conservative, xenophobic, and are against immigration. In short, they believe we, the people of the nation, are under threat from elites and outsiders. We must reclaim control. Far-right populism is strongly authoritarian socially and culturally, and sometimes politically, but may retain some democratic forms, such as elections, as a tool for legitimization. The alt-right, or the alternative right, is a relatively new strain of the far-right that emerged in the 2010s. They believe that Western nations should preserve their white European identity, and immigration and multiculturalism are seen as existential threats. They reject global institutions, multiculturalism, international trade agreements, and globalist elites. They believe pluralism, liberal democracy, and equality weaken the nation. They advocate for leaders who are patriarchal, ethnocentric, and anti-egalitarian. They oppose feminism, LGBTQ+ rights, secularism, and progressive social change. Essentially, they believe in natural gender roles. The alt-right is a digital age far-right movement defined by white identity politics, anti-globalism, and cultural authoritarianism. It's strongly authoritarian because it demands hierarchy, conformity, and the suppression of pluralism to impose its ethno-nationalist vision. Fascism is one of the clearest examples of the far right, but also one of the most extreme. It's not just authoritarian conservatism, it's a distinct revolutionary ideology of the 20th century that combined nationalism, authoritarianism, and mass mobilization. They believe the nation is sacred, organic, and superior, that it must be unified under one identity. They believe the state must control politics, culture, economy, and society. They reject democracy, individual rights, and pluralism, and often glorify a lost golden age that must be restored, while presenting themselves as forging a new, heroic order. Fascists are far right because they believe in hierarchy, inequality, and nationalism. They reject universal human rights in favour of ethnic and national dominance, and they believe in natural social orders, men over women, natives over foreigners, and leaders over people. Fascism is an ultranationalist, revolutionary, far-right ideology that rejects democracy and liberalism, embraces totalitarian control, glorifies violence, and demands loyalty to a single leader and state, making it one of the most authoritarian political movements in history. So, those are all the political labels and theories I'm going to talk about in this episode. If it wasn't clear before, I hope you're a lot more confident in articulating your political beliefs after listening to this episode. I would say that classical liberalism resonates best with my worldview right now and how I view politics, which seems to fall on the centre-right of the political spectrum. I advocate for freedom of thought, speech, religion, and property, since they're the most valuable, inalienable rights that incentivize people to carry on existing, essentially. Freedom of thought incentivizes innovation, freedom of speech incentivizes criticism, and therefore improvement. Freedom of religion incentivizes people to subscribe to philosophies that help people to perceive their lives as meaningful and therefore worthy of living, and the freedom to own capital or property incentivizes people to find creative ways of contributing to society, which is why I prefer a capitalistic structure to a socialistic or communist society. Although I love the idea of a government or state that invariably acts in the best interest of society, I believe that history has taught us that it's human nature to vie for power and keep up with the Joneses, so to speak. That's why I believe in a system that prioritizes minimum government intervention. They should only exist to protect our freedoms. That means a strong rule of law, an equal application of those laws, and constitutional constraints on the power of the government, as they have a human proclivity to abuse those powers. I would advocate for tolerance and pluralism, as long as by tolerating different views, it doesn't tolerate beliefs that infringe upon other people's freedoms, and I only oppose large welfare states, as I believe that anything that incentivizes people to not contribute to society is inherently counterproductive. Now, although I could go into further detail about my own political beliefs, I'm going to wrap up this episode as it's already been lengthy enough. I'd be interested in hearing your own political beliefs and why you believe these things, so feel free to email me at theperspicaciousperspective@gmail.com to give me something to think about. Hopefully you learned something from this episode and you enjoyed listening to it. Thanks for tuning in, and until the next episode.